Okay, welcome back to the Center for Critical and Cultural Theory. We are continuing on with our contextualized reading of Jacques Derrida's essay, Force of Law, sharing the screen with you and just picking up right off from where we were in the last video. Benjamin's text had been critiquing police violence as it exists in liberal democracies. Remember that he's writing in the 1920s as a liberal democracy has been imposed onto post-war Germany. And there are critics from the right of liberal democracy, that would be Carl Schmitt, and there are critics from the left, people like Walter Benjamin, who are critiquing this particular moment. According to Benjamin's text, which is a critique of violence, there are two forms of violence. There is foundational or mythic violence, and there is conservational violence as well. Uh, and then we will talk a bit more as we go on about this notion of divine violence that disrupts the law itself, right? And that comes in if we're going to try and find a critique of violence. There's the violence that exists in the state, and then there is the violence of the general strike, which is informed by the state because, of course, it's the state's conditions that informs the revolutionary violence, and in that disrupting of the legal system that becomes the revolution is also the moment of deconstruction, also the moment of what would be messianic or divine violence, at least in Benjamin's reading. Derrida is going to differ from that by the end of this text here. But where we're at is the degeneracy of originary violence that happens in modern democracies. Um, so picking up where my yellow highlight is here, uh, here is Benjamin deploring the verfall of revolution and parliamentary spectacle. Quote, when the consciousness of the latent presence of violence is an illegal institution disappears, the institution falls into decay. So we might look again, Derrida is writing this in 1989. He's thinking back to the 1920s. I've been using examples from the United States in the past 10 years or so, but we see with an escalation of police violence and the enacting of police violence that's erupted, especially in the form of racialized violence, the arbitrariness of police who are doing the enacting of the death penalty without recourse to an entire legal system, but jumping right to the most extreme forms of violence, that this would be a signal in the Benjamin's reading, this would be a signal that the institutions of democracy are themselves in decay, in degeneracy. And all we need to do is look at the state of the police. The first example chosen in going back to Benjamin's essay here, the first example chosen is that of the parliaments of the time. If they offered a deplorable spectacle, it's because these representative institutions forget the revolutionary violence from which they are born. In Germany, in particular, they've forgotten the abortive revolution of 1919. They have lost the sense of the founding violence of law that is represented in them. They lack the sense that a lawmaking violence is represented by themselves. Direct quote from Benjamin's text. The parliaments live in forgetfulness of the violence from which they are born. This amnesic denegation is not a psychological weakness. It is their statute, their structure. From this point on, instead of coming to decisions commensurable or proportional to this violence and worthy worthy of it, they practice hypocritical politics of compromise. This is a critique of liberal democracy from the left, right? that there is this amnesia of the founding violence. Um, it leads to the absence of something like a sovereign, and to all sorts of hypocrisies and compromises that forget what is at stake in the very foundation. Now, it gets again from the right wing perspective. This is what Carl Schmitt, where Carl Schmitt agrees with Benjamin, right? Which is that without the with the absence of a strong sovereign, liberal democracies end up in like endless debates, endless partisan fighting, and things don't get done, and it leads to the desire for a big eruption or some sort of a revolution, right? Because of the stalemate, and I bring those examples, and I think that for many people in the United States today, the way that people tend to frequently critique Washington and the partisan struggles that have just become nastier and nastier in the past 15 to 20 years, for sure, that this would signal the erosion of democratic institutions themselves. But it's also just at the heart of what, according to Benjamin and Schmidt, critiques of what liberal democracy would be. The concept of compromise, the denegation of open violence, the recourse to dissimulated violence belong to the spirit of violence, to the mentality of violence that goes so far as to accept coercion of the adversary to avoid to avoid the worst, at the same time saying to itself with the sigh of the parliamentarian that this certainly isn't ideal, that no doubt this would have been better otherwise, but that uh, precisely one couldn't do it otherwise. Parliamentarism then is in violence and in renunciation of the ideal. Now, this is exactly what happens, in 1933, right? With where in Germany, uh, there is a perceived threat from both the far right, and the far left. And the centrists, in order to stave off the far left, embrace Hitler and the rise of the far right. And once Hitler comes in, the first thing he does is declare a, a state of emergency or a state of exception, and then that lasts from 1933 until 1945. So what Benjamin is saying here is that the compromises that are led um, with the degeneration of liberal democracy, they lead to the militaristic takeover of something like dictatorship in the Nazi sense, right? It's of course the communist trajectory would be a different way, but they are blocked, at least in 1933, in Germany. So in the face of the decay of parliaments, Benjamin finds the critique of the Bolshevists and the trade unionists both pertinent overall and radically destructive as well. So again, if we went back to, I was projecting to 1933 there, but we could go back to the critiques that we read in Lenin's State and Revolution, to the Bolshevists, against the more centrist forces, and the Bolsheviks needed the to invoke the violence to make the Russian Revolution happen, right? So violence could come from either the far left or the far right, but liberal democracy is just going to be to degenerate itself into one of those particular uh, trajectories. So now we must introduce a distinction that once again brings together Benjamin and one Carl Schmitt, and in any case gives a more precise sense of what the historical configuration could have been in which all of these different modes of thinking were inscribed. The exorbitant price Germany had to pay for the defeat, the Weimar Republic, the crisis and impotence of the new parliamentarism, the failure of pacifism, the aftermath of the October Revolution in Russia, right? Conflict between the media and parliamentarism, new particulars of international law, and so forth. We just saw in sum that in its origin and its end, in its foundation and its conservation, le droit, the law, was inseparable from violence, immediate or immediate, present or represented. Does this exclude all nonviolence in elimination of conflicts, as we might placidly conclude? Not at all. Benjamin does not exclude the possibility of nonviolence, but the thought of nonviolence must exceed the order of public law. Union without violence or nonviolent agreement is possible everywhere at that the culture of the heart gives men pure means with accord and view. Does this mean that we must stop at this opposition between private and public to protect a domain of nonviolence? Things are far from that simple. On the conceptual divisions which delimit in the sphere of politics itself the relation of violence to nonviolence, let me just read that again. Other conceptual divisions will delimit in the sphere of politics itself the relation of violence to nonviolence. This would be, for example, the tradition of Sorel and Marx, the distinction between the general political strike, violent since it wants to replace the state with another state, and the general proletarian strike, that revolution that instead of strengthening the state aims at its suppression as it aims at the elimination of, quote, sociologists, says Sorel, men of the world so fond of social reforms, intellectuals who have embraced the profession of thinking from the proletariat, sociologists, elegant amateurs of social reforms, or intellectuals who have made it their profession to think for the proletariat. Another distinction seems even more radical and closer to what concerns the violence of as a means. It opposes the order of means and representation precisely to the order of manifestation or strike, right? That's the word in French is for strike is manifestation. Once again, it is very much a question of violence of language, according to Derrida here, but also the advent of nonviolence through a certain language. Does the essence of language consist in signs considered as a means of communication as representation, or in a manifestation that no longer arises, or not yet, from the communication through signs, from communication in general, that is, from the means/end structure? Benjamin intends to prove that a nonviolent elimination of conflicts is possible in the world, in the private world, when it is ruled by the culture of the heart, cordial courtesy, sympathy, love of peace, and trust. Dialogue as a technique of civil agreement would be the most profound example, but by what token can violence be considered excluded from the private or the proper sphere? Benjamin's response may be surprising to some. The possibility of this nonviolence is attested to by the fact that the lie is not punished, nor is deception. Roman law and old German law did not punish them. To consider a lie an offense is a sign of decadence. Modern law loses faith in itself. It condemns deception not for moral reasons, but because it fears the violence that it might lead to on the victim's part. They may, in return, threaten the order of the law. It is the same mechanism as the one at work in the concession of the right to strike. It is a matter of limiting the worst violence with another violence. What Benjamin seems to be dreaming of is an order of nonviolence that withholds from the order of law, and so from the right to punish and lie, to punish the lie, not only the private relations, but even certain public relations, as in the general proletarian strike that Sorel speaks about, which is a strike that would not attempt um, to refound a state and a new law, or again, certain diplomatic relations in which, in manner analogous to private relations, certain ambassadors settle conflicts peacefully without treaties. Arbitration is nonviolent in this case because it is situated beyond all order of law and so beyond violence. We shall see in a moment how this nonviolence is not without affinity to pure violence. So here Benjamin proposes an analogy that we should linger over for the moment, particularly because it brings in the enigmatic concept of faith. What would happen if, or excuse me, of fate? What would happen if a violence linked to fate, um, if and using just means, found itself in an insoluble conflict with just ends, and in such a way that we had to envision another kind of violence that, regarding these ends, would be neither a justified nor an unjustified means. Neither a justified or nor an unjustified means. Undeniably, it would no longer even be a means, but would enter into a whole other relation with the pair of means slash end. Then we would be dealing with a wholly other violence that would no longer allow itself to be determined in the space opened by the opposition of means slash end. The question is all the more grave in that it exceeds or displaces the initial problematic that Benjamin had up to this point constructed on the subject of violence and law, and that was entirely governed by the concept of means. Here it will be noticed that there are cases in which posed in terms of means slash end, the problem of law remains undecidable. The ultimate undecidability, which is that of all problems of law, quote, ultimate insolubility of all legal problems, is the insight of a singular and discouraging experience. Where is one to go after recognizing the ineluctable undecidability? Such a question opens first upon another dimension of language, an au-delà, a beyond, above, meditation, and so beyond language as sign in the sense of mediation as a means without an end in view. It seems at first that there is no way out, and so no hope. But at the impasse, this despair, this insolubility, this hopelessness summons up decisions of thought concerning nothing less than the origin of language in the relation of truth, destinal violence that puts itself above reason, then above this violence itself. God, another, a wholly other mystical foundation of authority. It is not, to be sure, Montaigne's or Pascal's, but we should trust too much, but we shouldn't trust too much this distance. That is what the um Osik of Dwight, I don't know that German word, excuse me, in some way opens up. That is where the impasse or of law leads. There would be an analogy between the undecidability of all the problems of law and what happens in the emergent language in which it is impossible to make a clear, convincing, determinate decision between the true and the false, correct or incorrect. This is only an analogy proposed in passing, but it could be developed on the basis of other Benjamin texts on language, notably The Task of the Translator from 1923, and especially the famous essay of 1916, 5 years before, on language and the general human language. Um, Interesting other essays of Benjamin, and I want to interject here and think about like that Benjamin's thinking in the late 19 teens adds in a kind of mystical approach to language. And so I think that this is where we're going to get some of the Jewish messianism sort of erupting here. Of course, he's having dialogues at the time with Gershom Scholem as well. So here Derrida is reaching into the intertextuality of other Benjaminian essays, to make this point. He says both of these essays put into question the notion of the essence of language, that the essence of language is originally communicative, that is to say semiological, informative, representative, conventional, and mediatory. That there's like the suggestion in on language essay that language isn't just a means, right, towards an end of something like communication. It is not a means with an end in view, a thing or signified content to which it would have adequate itself correctly. This critique of the sign was political then as well. The conception of language as a means and as a sign will be bourgeois. In the 1916 text defined uh, the 1916 text defined original sin as that fall into language of mediate communication, where words having become means incite babbling, the question of a good and evil after the creation arising from this babbling. The tree of knowledge was not there to provide knowledge of good and evil, but as the sign betokening judgment borne by he who questions. The extraordinary irony, Benjamin concludes, is the sign by which the mythical origin of what of law is recognized. And so this is drawing on particular Jewish readings of the Genesis story as well, and where the fall particular happens, but the creation of a distinction between good and evil, that is at the heart of like what Christians kind of call the original sin, but in the Jewish readings is actually kind of what propels us into our humanness as well. What will become in Levinas's thinking a kind of Jewish humanism as well. Benjamin is not a Levinasian for sure, but that distinction is going to be there. And my mentioning this is just to say both Derrida and Benjamin, being both Jewish, they're not necessarily drawing on the kind of original sin conception that we might in the Euro-Christian world associate with someone like St. Augustine's notion of original sin. Beyond this simple analogy, Benjamin here wants to conceive of a finality, a justice of ends that is no longer tied to the possibility of Dwat. In any case, to what is always conceived as universalizable. The universalization of law is its very possibility. It is analytically inscribed in the concept of justice. But in this case, what is not understood is that this universality is in contradiction with God himself. That is, with the one who decides the legitimacy of the means and the justice of ends over and above reason and even above the destinal violence. This sudden reference to God above reason and universality beyond the sort of afklorum, enlightenment of law, is nothing other than a reference to the irreducible singularity of each situation. And the audacious thought, as necessary as it is perilous, of what I shall here call a sort of justice without law, this is not one of Benjamin's expressions, is just as valid for a uniqueness of the individual as for the people and the language, in short, for history. So again, some Jewish readings of the text here. We might think about if we're thinking about language in the Hebrew language, and the first letter of the alphabet being the Aleph, which is a consonant, but it stands for silence, right? And so that is also the like within all three so-called religions of the book, but definitely Judaism being the oldest of the three, there is the inability to represent the divine, right? There's the inability to say the name of God in the Tetragrammaton, for example. And the letter that is the symbol, only the visual symbol of something profound as silence, right? Like, how do we represent the thing that is unrepresentable? Um, that is where the divine comes in and sort of encapsulates what then within the human tradition, through the Garden of Eden, through becoming finite in form, uh, becoming knowing the difference between good and evil that creates the possibility of justice, but that's also a separation from the divine itself, right? And so law or justice itself is going to be contained within this larger sort of concept of God, but it is also a separation from God because it only can relate to the idea of that being towards death that is necessarily part of the human condition. Um, so moving on along here, um, uh, to explain this non-mediate function of violence. So he's getting at what will become divine violence here, right? Benjamin again takes the example of everyday language as if it were only an analogy. In fact, it seems to me we have here the true mechanism in the very place of the decision. It is by chance and unrelated to such a figure of God that he speaks then of the experience of anger, an example of an immediate manifestation that has nothing to do with any means/end structure. The explosion of violence and anger is not a means that looks towards an end. It has no object other than to show and show itself. Let us leave the responsibility for this concept to Benjamin, the in some way disinterested, immediate, and uncalculated manifestation of anger. What matters to him is a manifestation of violence that would not be a means looking towards an end. Such would be mythic violence and the manifestation of the gods, and of course the angry God of the what Christians call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible is showing up there. Um, Here begins the last sequence, the most enigmatic of Benjamin's essay, right? The most fascinating and the most profound in the text. For lack of time, but not only time, I cannot claim to do it justice. I will have to content myself with stressing, on the one hand, the terrible ethico-political ambiguity of the text, on the other hand, the exemplary instability of its status and its signature, what finally you will permit me to call this heart or courage, or a thinking that knows that there is no justice, no justice, no responsibility except in exposing oneself to all the risks beyond the certitude and good conscience. Again, there's going to be something, I think, hovering in the background there of the Hineni in Jewish thought, right? Of the God calling one into existence, the God calling to Abraham in this case, of saying the name Abraham, and Abraham saying, "Here I am, Hineni, here I am." So like, and there's something about being called into the recognition of ourselves through language itself. And I think definitely Derrida's interest in Levinas, who takes those themes and runs with them towards ethical thought in general, is going to be certainly on Derrida's mind. And I think partly why Derrida is so intrigued by this and would like to chase it down, but that would take him away from his task that he's trying to complete here, and that we're trying to complete after this many video um, readings. In the Greek world, the manifestation of divine violence in its mythic form founds a law rather than enforcing an existing one by distributing compensations and punishments. It's not a distributive or retributive justice, and Benjamin invokes the legendary examples of Niobe, Apollo and Artemis, Prometheus, as it is a matter of founding a new law. The violence that falls upon Niobe comes from fate, and this fate can only be uncertain and ambiguous since it is not preceded or regulated by anterior superior transcendent law. This founding violence is not, quote, properly destructive, since, for example, it respects the mother's life in the moment it brings a bloody death to Niobe's children. But this allusion to blood spilled, as we shall see, is here a discriminating index for identifying the mythical and the violent foundation of law in the Greek world, and it distinguishes it from divine violence of Judaism. So Benjamin offers multiple examples of this ambiguity and even of the, quote, demonic ambiguity of this mythical positioning of law, which is in its fundamental principle a power, a force, a position of authority. And so, as Sorel himself suggests with Benjamin's apparent approval here, a privilege of kings, of the power, great powerful. At the origin of all law is a privilege. In the beginning, all right was the prerogative of kings and the nobles, in short of the mighty. At this originary and mythic moment, there is no distributive justice, no chastisement or penalty, only the expiation. And there are echoes of definitely Nietzsche going on there. The idea that what kings have, or that what nobility has, is the monopoly on violence, without any kind of recourse to question that kind of violence, um, as well. There's something there that seems to be at the root of sovereignty, and definitely Derrida's not going back to this, but we could think about texts like Mitra Waruna, as a text by the mythologist Georges Dumézil, for example, who's looking at that kind of context both in ancient um, uh, Indian thought and mythology, and the way that it maneuvers into through the Middle East into early Roman thought, right? Between Romulus as the first king and Numa, the second priest king, and there's a kind of dialectical relationship there. At the root here is just the idea of the power of where sovereignty itself comes from. Now, Benjamin, according to Derrida, is hovering between the Greek conception and the divine conception that might be from the Judaic tradition as well here. To this violence of the Greek mythos, Benjamin opposes feature for feature the violence of God. From all points of view, he says it is its opposite. Instead of founding law, it destroys it. Instead of setting limits and boundaries, it annihilates them. Instead of leading to error and expiation, it causes to expiate. Instead of threatening, it strikes. And above all, this is the essential point. Instead of killing with blood, it kills and annihilates without blood shed. Blood makes all the difference. the interpretation of this thought of blood is as troubling, despite certain dissonances in Benjamin, as it is in Rosenzweig, um, Franz Rosenzweig, especially if we think of the quote final solution. Blood is the symbol of life, he says, and making blood flow. The mythological violence of law is exercised in its own favor against life pure and simple, which causes it to bleed, even as it remains precisely within the order of natural life. In contrast, purely divine, just or Judaic violence is exercised on all life, but to the profit or in favor of the living. The quote here from Benjamin: mythical violence is bloody power over mere life for its own sake. Divine violence, pure power over all life for the sake of the living. In other words, mythological violence of law is satisfied in itself by sacrificing the living, while divine violence sacrifices life to save the living in favor of the living. In both cases, there is sacrifice, but in the case where blood is exacted, the living is not respected. When Benjamin's singular conclusion, or whence Benjamin's singular conclusion, and again, I leave to him responsibility for this interpretation, particularly for this interpretation of Judaism. Quote, the first slash mythological violence of law demands sacrifice. The second, divine violence, accepts it, assumes it. In any case, this divine violence, which will be attested to not only by religion, but also by and present in life or manifestations of the sacred, may annihilate goods, life, law, the foundation of law, and so on, but never amounts to an attack to destroy the soul of the living. Consequently, we have no right to conclude that divine violence leaves the field open for all human crimes. Thou shalt not kill remains the absolute imperative once the principle of the most destructive divine violence commands the respect of the living being beyond law, beyond judgment. It is not a criterion of judgment, but a guideline for the actions of persons or communities who have to wrestle with it in solitude in exceptional cases to take on themselves the responsibility of ignoring it. That, for Benjamin, is the essence of Judaism, which forbids all murder except in the singular cases of legitimate self-defense, and which sacralizes life to the point that certain thinkers extend this sacralization beyond man to include animal and vegetable. But here we should sharpen the point of what Benjamin means by the sacrality of man, life, or rather human Dasein. It's mixing Heideggerian language here, which is interesting. Benjamin stands up vigorously against all sacralization of life for itself, natural life, the simple fact of life, commenting at length on the words of Kurt Hiller, according to which, quote, higher even than the happiness and the justice of existence stands existence itself. Benjamin judges the proposition that simple Dasein should be higher than just Dasein, to be false and ignoble if simple Dasein is to take to mean is taken to mean the simple fact of living. And while noting that these terms Dasein and life remain very ambiguous, he judges the same proposition, however ambiguous it may remain, in the opposite way as the full powerful truth, if it means that man's non-being would be still more terrible than man's not yet being, just then that not the not yet attained condition of the just man purely and simply. Starting to get Derrida's critique of Benjamin showing up here, right? In other words, what makes for the worth of man, of his Dasein, his being there, and his life is what he contains, is that he contains the potential, the possibility of justice, this yet to come, the to avenir of justice, to the yet to come of his being just, of his having to be just. What is sacred in his life is not his life, but the justice of his life. Even if beasts and plants were sacred, they would not be so simply on for their own life, says Benjamin. The critique of vitalism or biologism, if it also resembles one by a certain Heidegger, and if he recalls, as I've noted elsewhere, a certain Hegel, here proceeds like the awakening of a Judaic tradition. Because of this ambiguity in the concepts of life and Dasein, Benjamin is both drawn to and reticent before the dogma that affirms the sacred character of life as natural life, pure and simple. The origin of this dogma deserves inquiry, notes Benjamin, who is ready to see in the relatively modern and nostalgic response to the West to those to the loss of the sacred. So there's so much going on here. And again, there is a larger discussion in Benjamin's time about this loss of the sacred. It will show up in Mircea Eliade and his book, The Sacred and the Profane. It shows up to a certain extent in Max Weber's sense of disenchantment, that we have lost our mythical conception. We've lost our ability to really think religion. We've become come to the point where we regard all religion as pure superstition, and therefore we have lost meaning in our lives as well. And Benjamin is being coupled here in Derrida's reading with Heidegger and with this notion of Dasein, which is being there, which must be the first place of thinking philosophy. Now, what Derrida is doing here and what's going to lead into his critique is Derrida's influence from Levinas, which is, and Levinas's critique of Heidegger is going to be that before we can even have any discussion of being there, we're always already in relationship to another person. So ethics must be the foundation of first philosophy rather than ontology or the study of the nature of being, right? But this is going to be a place where Benjamin is being associated quite intimately with Heideggerian thought, but not with Levinasian thought. And this is, but that isn't to say that Benjamin isn't drawing on his own interpretation of the Jewish tradition as well. Um, uh, Now Benjamin in his own life, is comes from a family, a rather bourgeois family, that doesn't have an intimate correct relationship to practicing Judaism, but um, uh, Benjamin falls in line into interest with other Jews like Gershom Scholem, for like Franz Rosenzweig, and is interpreting in this kind of broad historical civilizational sense the meaning of what Judaism might be in history, especially in its relationship to Greek thought, right? So that's what's going on in his thinking, and he is recovering a kind of um, uh, uh, a kind of Jewish messianism, but it won't be the kind that Derrida and Levinas are landing in. It is an attempt to recover something like the sacred, right? That there's a kind of nostalgia there. Uh, so we go on. Which is the ultimate and most provocative paradox of this critique of violence? The one that offers the most to think about? It is that this critique presents itself as the only, quote, philosophy of history, the word philosophy remaining in unforgettable quotation marks, that makes possible the attitude that is not merely critical, but in the mere critical and diacritical sense of the word critique, an attitude that permits us to choose and to so decide and to cut decisively in history on and on the subject of history. This is probably what critical theory does, right? It is the only one, Benjamin says, that permits us in respect to the present time to take a decisive position, discriminating and decisive approach. All undecidability is situated, blocked in, accumulated on the side of law, a mythological violence, that is to say, the violence that founds and conserves law. But on the other hand, all decidability stands on the side of a divine violence that destroys the law. We could even venture to say deconstructs it. To say that all decidability is found on the side of divine violence that destroys or deconstructs the law is to say at least two things. First, that history is on the side of divine violence, because divine violence must recognize sacral violence to begin with, and then approach with its own form of violence. So it comes second in line, right? That history is on the side of divine violence, and that history precisely in opposition to myth. It is indeed for this reason that it's a matter of a quote philosophy of history, and that Benjamin appeals in fact to a new historical era, one that should follow the end of the mythological or the mythic reign, the interruption of the magic circle and the mythic form of law, the abolition of Staatsgewalt, the violence of authority of the state. This new historical era would be a new political era on the condition that politics is not tied to state control, as Schmidt, for example, would have it. So there's going to be reinterpretation of a kind of Jewish humanism that's going to lead us away from the idea of the state as the iteration of Euro-Christian sovereignty that Schmidt wants to hold on to. No, there has to be this fuller consideration of what divine violence actually is, what that civilizational element that's brought to Greek culture from Judaic culture allows for in human social relations, which need not be state-based, right? Which is going to be informed by Walter Benjamin's leftism here, but also this kind of mystical leftism, for lack of a better word there, that characterizes thinkers like him and his contemporaries. So it's indeed for this reason that it's a matter of philosophy that there's going to be an end to state violence. We need to come to a new conception. And there is something Hegelian. There is something about Aufheben, right? That annihilating principle of um, uh, uh, moving through a dialectical way of thinking about the world. And that might be something that Derrida pushes back against as well. Point two here is going to be that if all decidability is concentrated on the side of divine violence in the Judaic tradition, this would come to confirm and to give meaning to the spectacle offered by the history of law, which deconstructs itself and is paralyzed in undecidability, since what Benjamin calls the dialectic or of up and down in the founding violence or conserving violence of law constitutes an oscillation in which the violence that conserves must constantly give up to the repression of hostile counter-violences. But this repression and law, the juridical institution, is essentially repressive from this point of view, never ceases to weaken the foundation of violence that it represents. And so it destroys itself in the course of this cycle. For here, Benjamin, to some extent, recognizes this law of iterability that ensures that the founding violence is constantly represented in a conserving violence that always repeats the tradition of its origin and that ultimately keeps nothing but a foundation of destined from the start to be repeated, conserved, reinstituted. Benjamin says that founding violence is, quote, represented in conservative violence. To think at this point that we have cast light and correctly interpreted the meaning of what Benjamin wishes to say, or what his text wishes to say, or wants to say, by opposing in a decidable way the decidability of divine, revolutionary, historical, anti-state, anti-juridical violence on the one side, and on the other, the undecidability of the mythical violence of the state, of state law, would still be decide too quickly and not to understand the power of this text. So he doesn't want to reduce Benjamin he doesn't want to oversimplify Benjamin here. But he says, for in its last lines, a new act of drama is played, or a coup de théâtre, that I couldn't swear was not premeditated from the moment of the curtain went up. What does Benjamin, in fact, say? Well, first, he speaks in the conditional about revolutionary violence. If beyond law, violence sees its status ensured as pure and immediate violence, then this will prove that revolutionary violence is possible. Then we would know, but this is a conditional clause, that it is this revolutionary violence whose name is the purest manifestation of violence among men. But why is this statement in the conditional? It's a good question that Derrida asks. Is it only provisional and contingent? Not at all. For the decision on the subject, the determinate decision, the one that permits us to know or to recognize such a pure revolutionary violence, as such, is a decision not accessible to man. Here we must deal with a whole other undecidability, and I prefer to cite Benjamin's sentence in its fullest. Quote, but it is neither equally possible nor equally urgent for man to decide when pure violence was effected in a determined case. Less possible and also less urgent for humankind, however, is to decide when unalloyed violence has been realized in particular cases. The results from the fact that divine violence, which is the most just, the most historic, the most revolutionary, the most decidable, or the most deciding, does not lend itself to any human determination, to any knowledge or decidability, or decidable, quote, certainty on our part. It's never known in itself as such, but only in its effects, and its effects are incomparable. They do not lend themselves to any conceptual generalization. There is no certainty or determinate knowledge except in the realm of mythic violence, that is, of droit, or law, that is, of the undecidable we have been talking about. Quote, for only mythical violence, not divine violence, will be recognizable as such with certainty, unless it be in incomparable effects. To be schematic, there are two violences, two competing Gewalten. On the one side, decision, just, historical, political, and so on, justice beyond law and the state, but without decidable knowledge. On the other, decidable knowledge and certainty in a realm that structurally remains that of the undecidable, of the myth of law of the state. On the one side, decision without decidable certainty. On the other side, the certainty of the undecidable without decision. In any case, in one form or another, the undecidable is on each side, and the violent condition of knowledge or action. But knowledge and action are always dissociated. Again, I feel like in the shadow of this text is Kant as well here, the in itself, the a priori notions of that there could be some sort of metaphysic of morals of right action versus like the fact that we live embodied lives with this thing called the will. So very much an example of what I in my other work call Euro-Christian thinking, even though, of course, what Benjamin is doing is working on some conditions and some readings of what Judaism brings into its dialectical conversation with Greek thought, right? The ultimate outcome of that is going to be the sort of Christ moment, right? Although that's not but where Derrida or Benjamin is necessarily taking it, but the take of the acceptance of Christ's sacrifice by God being an acceptance of the sacrifice itself and the foundation for a new sort of order. That is going to be where I feel like more 21st century philosophers like Zizek, like Alain Badiou, who in their interest in St. Paul, who is Jewish, it's important, even though we associate Paul with the Christian tradition, he is very much a Jew. As were like almost all of the first Christians as well, right? So uh, that's a different sort of conversation. But definitely Kant is hovering behind here. Definitely, well, to a certain extent, Hegel, I feel like is hovering behind here as well in the projection of the dialectic that forms a trajectory of history that requires us to think the philosophy of history, which is going to be the way that Heidegger is coming in here as well. Um, as we maneuver on here, I'm going to finish the major portion of this essay here. The questions that come up here, um, Derrida says, is what one calls in the singular, if there is one and only one deconstruction. Is it the former or the latter? Something else entirely or something else again? If we trust the Benjaminian schema, is the deconstructive discourse on the undecidable more Jewish or Judeo-Christian Islamic or Greek? More religious, more mythic, or more philosophical? If I do not answer the questions that take this form, it is not only because I'm not sure that such a thing as deconstruction in the singular exists or is possible. It is also because I think that deconstructive discourses, as they present themselves in their irreducible plurality, participate in an impure, contaminating, negotiated, bastard, and violent way in all these filiations. Let's call them Judeo-Greek to save time, of decision and undecidable. And then the Jew and the Greek that may not be exactly what Benjamin had in mind for us. And finally, for what remains to come in deconstruction, I think that something else runs through its veins, perhaps without filiation, an entirely different blood, or rather something entirely different from blood. Again, I think that like in the language that I use in my own texts, I think that what Derrida is critiquing here is the Euro-Christian worldview, what erupts as the Euro-Christian worldview. He uses different terminologies here. He says, should we call it, the religions of the book, which would then include Islam as well. Um, but it is all part of a formation that comes to fruition or to filiation through the intermixing between Jewish and Greek thought and the world that erupts from that particular moment, and conceptions of law, of course, that erupts from those moments. The sort of cradle of so-called Western civilization that Derrida has claimed is what needs to be rethought if we're really going to think about deconstruction and the possibility of justice. And so in saying adieu or au revoir, in saying goodbye to Benjamin, I nevertheless leave him the last word. I let him sign, at least if he can. It is always necessary that the other sign, and it is always that other that signs last, and other words first. In his last lines, Benjamin just before signing even uses the word, quote, bastard. That, in short, is the definition of the myth and of the founding violence of law. Mythic law, or droit, we could say juridical fiction, is violence that will have bastardized the central, or the eternal forms of pure divine violence. Myth has bastardized divine violence with law. Misalliance and pure genealogy, not a mixture of bloods, but bastardy, which at its root will have created a law that makes blood flow and exacts blood as payment. And then, as soon as he has taken responsibility for this interpretation of the Greek and the Jew, Benjamin signs. He speaks in evaluative, prescriptive, non-constitutive manner as we do each time we sign. Two energetic sentences proclaim that we must be the watchwords and what one must do, what one must reject, the evil or perversity of what must be rejected. But one must reject all mythical violence, the violence that founds law, which we may call governing violence. One must also reject the violence that conserves the law, the governed violence, in the service of the governing. The English translation, as it is often is insipid, but all mythical law-making violence, which we may call executive, is pernicious. Pernicious, too, is the law-preserving administrative violence that serves it. Then we are at the last words, the last sentence, like the chopard at night, or the brink of a prayer, or one no longer hears, or does not yet hear. Not only does it sign this ultimate address, the very close in the first name of Benjamin, Walter, it also names the signature, the sign, the seal, and the seal. It names the name of what calls itself Die Waltend. But who signs? It is God, the holy other. As always, it is the divine violence that always will have proceeded, but also will have given all the first names. Divine violence, this is the direct quote, divine violence, which is the sign and seal, but never the means of sacred execution, may be called sovereign violence. That's how Benjamin ends, but then of course Jacques Derrida signs his name here as well. Okay, so this is an intense essay, right? But it gives us some insight into the way Jacques Derrida is reading himself into interaction with Benjamin, the way that he is um, uh, critiquing Benjamin at the same time, but also that he's getting at, and what the deconstruction of Benjamin's text gets us to arrive at, is this notion of sovereign violence. And that will become a huge part of discussion and critical theory in the 21st century. I'm going to continue on with the postscript here really quickly. Um, uh, um, Derrida, in his own voice here, he says, this strange text of Benjamin's is dated, right? Every signature is dated, even and perhaps all the more so if it slips among several names of God and only signs by pretending to let God himself sign. If this text is dated and signed Walter 1921, we have only a limited right to convoke it and bear witness to either Nazism in general, which happens, of course, 10 years later, um, uh, or to new forms assumed by by the racism and the anti-Semitism that are inseparable from it, or even less to the final solution, not only because the project and the deployment of the final solution came later and even after the death of Benjamin, but because within the history of Nazism, the final solution is something that some consider an ineluctable outcome and inscribed in the very premises of Nazism. If such a thing has a proper identity that can sustain this sort of utterance, while others, whether or not they are Nazis or Germans, might think that the project of a final solution is an event, indeed something entirely new within the history of Nazism, and that as such it deserves an absolutely specific analysis. For all of these reasons, we would not have the right, or we would only a limited right to ask ourselves what Walter Benjamin would have thought in the logic of this text, if it is one and only one of both Nazism and final solution. Um, and so, yeah, part of the critique here has been that Benjamin's reading aligns almost with a kind of Heideggerian conception of thinking fate in this particular way, of thinking of civilization in this particular way. Um, again, uh, is this sense of a messianic view of history um, amenable with what erupts with Nazism? Is the final solution a new thing in history, or is this something that, as in the book Dialectic of Enlightenment, that Horkheimer and Adorno trace to the very kernel of what in the foundation of Western civilization, with the Odyssey, with Homer, with Jewish and Greek thought, melding together the creation of what becomes Euro-Christian culture. We don't get from this particular essay of Benjamin anything definitive there. And yet, says Derrida, in a certain way, I will do just that. And I will do it by going beyond my interest for this text itself and its event and its structure for that which it allows us to read in the configuration of Jewish and German thinking right before the rise of Nazism, as one says, of all the shared portions and the partitions that organize such configuration of the vertiginous proximities, the radical reversals of pro into con on the basis of sometimes common premises, presuming that is that all these problems are really separable, which I doubt. In truth, I will not ask myself what Benjamin himself thought of Nazism and anti-Semitism, all the more so since we have other means of doing so, other texts by him. Nor will I ask what Walter Benjamin himself would have thought of the final solution and what judgments, what interpretations he would have proposed. I will seek something else in a modest and preliminary way. However enigmatic and overdetermined the logical matrix of this text might be, however mobile and inconvertible, however reversible it has its own coherence. This coherence also marks a number of other texts by Benjamin, both earlier and later ones. It is by taking account of certain insistent elements in this coherent continuity that I will try out several hypotheses in order to reconstitute not some possible utterances by Benjamin, but the larger aspects of the problematic and interpretive space in which his discourse on the final solution might have been inscribed. So now we're maneuvering out of Benjamin and into the Derridian interpretation of this, of course, after World War II, after the final solution, and up all events up to 1989. He says, on the one hand, Benjamin would have probably taken the final solution to be the extreme consequence of a logic of Nazism, that to take up again the concepts from our text would have corresponded to. First, the radicalization of evil linked to the fall into language of communication, representation, information. And from this point of view, Nazism has indeed been the most pervasive figure of media violence and political exploitation of the modern techniques of communicative language, of industrial language, of the language of industry, of science objectification, the non-literary language, non-aesthetic language, language as pure means, right? Language as instrumental logic, right? Instrumental rationality that so many people in Germany, Jewish and Christian, were already critiquing in Benjamin's moment here. Nazism seems to be an extension of that. Might bring that into the ways people think about AI, language, and instrumentality today, and the crises of liberalism that we face right now. Second, the totalitarian radicalization of a logic of the state, and our text is indeed a condemnation of the state, even in of the revolution, that it replaces a state by another state, which is also valid for other totalitarianisms. And already we see prefigured with the question of the historic Streit. Third, the radical but also fatal corruption of parliamentary and representative democracy through the modern police that is inseparable from it, that becomes the true legislative power and whose phantom commands the totality of political space. From this point of view, the final solution is both a historical political decision by the state and a decision by the police, the civil and the military police, without any one ever being able to discern the one from the other and to assign the true responsibilities to any one decision whatsoever. It's not even just Hitler and Hitler's final solution. It becomes embodied in the whole society and the whole expression of what Nazism was. Number four, the radicalization and total extension of mythical violence, both in its sacrificial founding moment and its most conservative moment. This mythological dimension that is at once Greek and aestheticizing, like fascism. Nazism is mythological, Greekoid, and if it corresponds to an aestheticization of the political, it is an aestheticization of an aesthetics of representation. This mythological dimension also responds to the certain violence of state law, of its police and its techniques, of right totally dissociated from justice, and the conceptual generality propitious to mass structure and in opposition to the consideration of singularity and uniqueness, right? The violence of fascism is in the full embrace of the historicity of the moment, becoming its own oneness with the actions that become the mythical violence of the state and all of the bloodbath that it turns into. It is in the lack of critique, right? It is the lack of saying no, or even the ability to say no. It is in the full embrace of the speed of the moment. And of course, recognized in here is that Derrida is recognizing what Benjamin calls in the essay um, uh, uh, um, on the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, that Nazism ends up in the aestheticization of politics. Of course, Derrida is associating that here with a Greek particular notion and saying that Benjamin is saying when Benjamin gives that critique, what Benjamin is saying is that there's a possibility through a kind of neo-messianic Judaism to be the forestalling of that mythical violence, but it has to take into account the divine violence, which will be the secondary element. And so Nazism is in some ways trying to found a new republic. It's or trying to found a new state, but it does so by hearkening back to a mythological violence. It is a denial of the history that as of history as it has been, in order to erase history, to in fact create a new foundational moment. But in doing so, it's been a denial of the divine violence that has always been a counterpart to the civilization as it exists to today, up to today, or up to the 1920s, I suppose. Um, how can one otherwise explain the institutional, even bureaucratic form, the simulacra of legislation of juridicism, the respect for expertise and hierarchies, in short, the whole judicial and state organization that marked the techno-industrial and scientific deployment of the final solution? Here, a certain mythology of right was unleashed against the justice, which Benjamin believed ought to be kept radically distinct from right, from natural law, or from natural as historic right, and from the violence of its foundation, as well as from its conservation. And Nazism was a conservative revolution of right. Of course, yeah, it erupts from the far right itself, and then the conservative violence and the mythic violence know no distinction from each other. It just becomes violence. Um, But on the other hand, and for these very reasons, because Nazism leads logically to the final solution as to its own limit, and because the mythological violence of right is its veritable system, one can only think that is also remember the uniqueness of the final solution from a place other than this space of mythological violence of right. To take the measure of this event and of what links it to destiny, one would have to leave the order of right, of myth, of representation, of juridico-political representation with its tribunals of historian judges, but also of aesthetic representation. Because what Nazism, as the final achievement of the logic of mythological violence, would have attempted to do is to exclude the other witness, to destroy the witness of the other order of a divine violence whose justice is irreducible to that right of a violence heterogeneous to the order of both right, be it that of human rights or the order of representation and of myth. In other words, one cannot sum up the uniqueness of an event like the final solution as extreme point of mythic and representational violence within its own system. One must try to think it beginning with its other, that is to say, starting from what it tried to exclude, to destroy, to exterminate radically from that which haunted it at once from without and within. One must try to think it starting from the possibility of singularity, the singularity of the signature and of the name, because what the order of representation tried to exterminate was not only human lives by the millions, natural lives, but also a demand for justice, and also names, and first of all, the possibility of giving, inscribing, calling, and recalling the name, not only because there was a destruction or projection of destruction of the name and of the very memory of the name as memory, but also of the cause of the system of mythical violence, objectivist, representational, communicational, etc., that went all the way to its limit in a demonic fashion on two sides of the limit. At the same time, it kept the archive of its destruction, produced simulacra and justificatory arguments with a terrifying legal bureaucratic statist objectivity that paradoxically produced a system in which its logic, the logic of objectivity, made possible the invalidation and therefore the effacement of testimony and of responsibilities, the neutralization of the singularity of the final solution. In short, it produced the possibility of historiographic perversion that has been able to give rise both to the logic of revisionism, to be brief, let us say, of the Fourierian type, as well as the positive comparativist or relativist objectivism, like the one now linked to Historikerstreit, according to which the existence of an analogous totalitarian model and the earlier exterminations, the Gulag, for example, explains the final solution, even normalizes it as an act of war, a classic state response in a time of war against the Jews of the world, who, speaking through the mouth of Weizmann in September 1939, would have in some, like the quasi-state, declared war on the Third Reich. From this point of view, Benjamin would perhaps have judged vain and without pertinence, in any case without pertinence commensurable to the event, and in any juridical trial of Nazism and of its responsibilities, any judgmental apparatus, any historiography still homogeneous, with the space in which Nazism developed up to the including the final solution, any interpretation of drawing on philosophical, moral, sociological, psychological, or psychoanalytic concepts, and especially juridical concepts, in particular those of philosophy of right, whether that be that of natural law in the Aristotelian style or the law of the Enlightenment. Benjamin would perhaps have judged vain and without pertinence any case without pertinence commensurable to the event, any historical aesthetic objectification of the final solution that, like all objectifications, would still belong to the order of the representable and even the determinable of the determinate and decidable judgment. Recall what we were saying a moment ago. In the order of the bad violence of right, that is, of mythological order, evil arose from a certain undecidability, from the fact that one could not distinguish between founding violence and conserving violence, because corruption was dialectical and dialectically inevitable there, even as theoretical judgment or representation were determinable or determinate there. On the contrary, as soon as one leaves this order, history begins, and the violence of divine justice. But here we humans cannot measure judgments, which is to say, also decidable interpretations. This also means that the interpretation of the final solution as of everything that constitutes the set and delimitation of the two orders, mythological and divine, is not in the measure of man. No anthropology, no humanism, no discourse of man, even on human rights, can be proportionate to either the rupture between the mythical and divine or to the limit experience such as the final solution. Such a project attempts to quite simply to annihilate the other of mythic violence, the other of representation, destiny, divine justice, and that which can bear witness to it. In other words, man, insofar as he is the only being who, not having received his name from God, has received from God the power and the mission to give a name to his own kind, and to give a name to things. To name is not to represent, it is not to communicate by signs, that is, by means of view of the end, of an end, etc. In other words, the line of the interpretation would belong to that terrible and crushing condemnation of the Aufklärung, or the Enlightenment, that Benjamin had already formulated in a text of 1918 published by Scholem in 1963 honoring Adorno on his 60th birthday. This does not mean that one must simply renounce enlightenment and the language of communication or representation in favor of the language of expression. In his Moscow diary from 1926, Benjamin specifies that a polarity between the two languages and all that they command cannot be maintained and deployed in a pure state, but that a compromise is necessary or inevitable between them. Yet this remains a compromise between two incommensurable and radically heterogeneous dimensions. It is perhaps one of the lessons that we could draw here, the fatal nature of the compromise between heterogeneous orders, which is a compromise, moreover, in the name the justice that would command one to obey at the same time the law of representations, enlightenment, Aufklärung, reason, objectification, comparison, explication, all, etc., and the law that transcends representation and withholds the all uniqueness from its reinscription in an order of generality or comparison. What I find in conclusion, this is Derrida speaking, right? What I find in conclusion, the most redoubtable, indeed perhaps almost intolerable into this text, even beyond the affinities it maintains with the worst, the critique of enlightenment, the theory of the fall of originary authenticity, the polarity between originary language and fallen language, the critique of representation and parliamentary democracy, etc. What Derrida finds objectionable in this text is a temptation that it would leave open, and leave open notably to the survivors or the victims of the final solution, to its past, present, or potential victims. Which temptation? The temptation to think about the Holocaust as an uninterpretable manifestation of divine violence, that as divine violence would be at the same time annihilating, expiatory, and bloodless, says Benjamin, a divine violence that would destroy the current law through a bloodless process that strikes the causes to expiate. In other words, like the idea of an interpretation, some sort of interpretation of the Holocaust as being itself a kind of sacrifice of Jewish people that is somehow accepted, as a sacrifice that is accepted by a God, is part of what is left open in the Benjaminian reading that Derrida cannot allow for. Here I will recite Benjamin, quote, "The end of Niobe may be confronted as an example of this violence, with God's judgment on the company of Korah. It strikes privileged Levites, strikes them without warning, without threat, and does not stop short of annihilation, but in annihilating it also expiates, and a deep connection between the lack of bloodshed and the expiatory character of this violence is unmistakable. When one thinks of the gas chambers," says Derrida, "and the cremation ovens, this allusion to an extermination that will be expiatory, because bloodless, must cause one to shudder. One is terrified at the idea of an interpretation that would make of the Holocaust an expiation and an indecipherable signature of the just and violent anger of God." It's at this point in the text, despite all of the polysemic mobility and all its resources for reversal, it seems to me finally to resemble too closely to the point of specular fascination and vertigo, the very thing against which one must act and think, do and speak, that which one must break. Perhaps. This text, like many others by Benjamin, is still too Heideggerian, too Messiano-Marxist or archaeo-eschatological for me, says Derrida. I do not know from this nameless thing called the final solution, or whether from this nameless thing called the final solution, one can draw something which still deserves the name of a lesson. But if there were a lesson to be drawn, a unique lesson among the always singular lessons of murder, from even a single murder, from all the collective exterminations of history, um, because each individual murder and each collective murder is singular, thus infinite and incommensurable. The lesson that we can draw today, if we can do so, then we must, is that we must think, know, represent for ourselves, formalize, judge the possibility, the possible complicity between all these discourses, and the worst, here the final solution. In my view, this defines a task and a responsibility, the theme of which, yes, a theme I have taken I've not been able to read in either Benjaminian deconstruction or Heideggerian deconstruction. It is the thought of difference between the destructions on the one hand and a deconstruction or a deconstructive affirmation on the other that has guided me tonight in this reading. It is thought that the memory of the final solution seems to me to dictate. So that's the end here. And of course, I've alluded throughout my contextualized reading here that what Derrida is bringing to his critique of Benjamin is not only his own critique as a Jew, but is definitely a Levinasian critique, not only of Benjamin here, but also of Heidegger here. So Derrida is aligning his own thought with Levinas's critique of Heidegger's conception of Dasein, not a completely a rejection of how interesting the thought is of Dasein, but that what we have before that in our thinking is always already a responsibility to the other. And Benjamin's text has this capacity for thinking of a kind of divine violence that is bigger, that couldn't even be adjudicated by humans, and thus this whole discussion of genocide and conventions on genocide and the crime of genocide, all of this stuff that erupts in the ideas of international law after World War II, the questions of how we can even adjudicate it, something like that, right? The late 1980s is when we're just getting still ratification, even in the United States, of the um, Genocide Convention, right? I mean, the United States had participated in the formation of it, but we don't get the signing on to those types of agreements right away. And then by the time that we have the International Criminal Court by the late 1990s, we have almost immediately after Clinton takes the United States into it, we have the United States pulling away from that particular um, formation of a legal entity in order to perpetrate some of the grossest forms of torture and human violence, um, uh, without making itself accountable as a nation to that, and so on and so forth, right? We get occasionally, we now have uh, in the wake of some other genocides, we've had some uh, former leaders who've gone on trial and been charged with genocide and all of that idea, but is not something that on the whole, even when people today are making charges of genocide um, uh, in Israel and Palestine, right? These are what that ends up being in the actual enactment, if it could be enacted in international law, is still very much something that's open to question in terms of both positive or hard law in particular nations, and then in soft law or international law in the international community. And so we're dealing with it at the international level, and we're of course dealing with it with police violence at the state level, and that's even in the 21st century as well. Um, I feel like Derrida is far from just being an uh, uh, chargeable with just being a pseudo intellectual. He does say that there must be a way to think through this, that there has to be actionable ways to address something like the final solution in law, but it does definitely take a deep consideration consideration of law and a deep consideration and deconstructing of the history of Western civilization. I think that we're definitely in that, but the very surface level right wing in the United States claims that people who are thinking about critical legal theory or critical race theory, which comes from critical legal theory, which is definitely part of the moment when Derrida has written this essay, to claim that they're just relativists or anarchists, or this they just want to destroy law, or that there's nothing reproachable in the kind of notion of Western civilization and all of its Christian Euro-Christian elements. And for many on the far right in the United States today, it's with it's being asserted as being a certain version of Christianity that is the fruition of this notion of Western civilization that should be claimed proudly, instead of being subjected to the deconstruction that is at the heart of what this essay is trying to get us to think in terms of what's at the heart of law and the possibility of justice itself. So I'm going to leave that this all of these this close reading. Many times I'm just reading actual words from the essay itself, and then extracting and pulling from my own interpretive readings here. We've seen Derrida as a critical theorist taking the critical theory tradition and a later trajectory of so-called French thought, so not just post-structuralist thought or deconstructionist thought, but extending and interacting and engaging with the Frankfurt theorist, Walter and Benjamin, and taking it into the more contemporary discussion in critical theory circles about divine or sovereign violence, about the post-secular, and to what extent religion is still with us even after the post-secular, or the Habermasian take that it is the job of liberal democracies to translate ideas from religious sort of register into civic life and liberal democracy. We're not reading Habermas in this particular case, but in his dialectic of secularization, which is his dialogue with then well, with Joseph Ratzinger, who then became Pope and then stepped down from being Pope as well. So as an essay, this is hopefully in the intro course, this is really, for all the work that we've done here, is it's setting up the themes that are very, very much with us in doing the work of critical theory in the 21st century. We're going to jump to Giorgio Agamben's book, State of Exception, as our final book in this intro course in our next contextualized reading lecture. Thank you for your attention to all of this and thinking alongside me with these readings. Support us on Patreon if you can. This is very much a labor of love for me right now, but it's also a labor of the love of thinking as well. So I appreciate anyone in the audience thinking alongside me. Have a great morning, evening, afternoon, day, night, wherever, whenever you are.